The Graveyard Shift. The gates of Hollow Hill Cemetery groaned as they swung shut behind Jake, the clang of iron ringing out in the cool evening air. He paused for a moment, taking in the sprawling graveyard before him. The shadows of ancient oak trees stretched across rows of tombstones, the moon's pale light casting the entire place in a ghostly glow. Jake swallowed hard, gripping the handle of his shovel just a bit tighter. It was his first night on the job, the first of many graveyard shifts, and already he felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. "Don't worry, kid. The dead don't bite," came a raspy voice from his right. Jake turned to see Paul, one of the older groundskeepers, leaning against a nearby mausoleum. His cigarette flared orange in the dim light. "Not unless you give him reason to." Jake gave a nervous laugh, unsure whether Paul was joking. The old man had been working here for over 20 years. The deep lines in his face told stories Jake wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The cemetery stretched for miles, an endless sea of stone markers and crypts. In the center stood an old, weathered chapel, its roof sagging and ivy crawling up its walls. The place looked more like a relic of the past than somewhere people were still buried. "Come on, you'll get used to it," Paul grunted, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "It's quiet work, mostly. Just keep the paths clear, trim the hedges, and lock up the gates after dark. Simple enough." Simple, Jake thought, but something about the cemetery felt anything but. As they began their walk toward the maintenance shed, his eyes caught movement near a cluster of gravestones. He stopped, squinting into the gloom, but saw nothing more than swaying branches in the breeze. Still, his skin prickled with unease. "You all right, kid?" Paul asked, glancing back at him. "Yeah," Jake muttered, forcing a smile. "Just thought I saw something." Paul chuckled. "You'll see a lot of things on the night shift. Your eyes play tricks out here with all the shadows and whatnot. Best not to let it get to you." Jake nodded, but the unease lingered. He had taken the job to get away from the noise of the city, to find some peace and solitude. But standing there among the graves, he realized solitude could feel suffocating in its own way. As they reached the shed, Paul handed Jake a set of keys. "You'll need these to lock up. The chapel, the gates, the mausoleums. Make sure everything's shut tight before you finish up for the night." Jake pocketed the keys, his fingers brushing cold metal. "Got it." Paul's eyes darkened for a moment, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "And one more thing, Jake. Don't wander too far past the old chapel. There's some places here better left alone." Before Jake could ask what he meant, Paul turned and headed off toward his truck, leaving Jake alone with the deepening twilight. With a sigh, Jake grabbed a pair of hedge clippers from the shed and began trimming the overgrown bushes along the path. The task kept his hands busy, but his mind wandered, replaying Paul's cryptic warning over and over. He cast a glance toward the chapel in the distance. It stood like a sentinel, dark and silent, watching over the graves like it had for centuries. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound. Was it whispering? Jake straightened, his heart thudding in his chest. He turned, peering into the rows of headstones. The air grew colder, the stillness broken only by the rustling of leaves. Then he saw it. A shadow, just beyond the farthest row of graves. It moved slowly, deliberately, disappearing behind a large tombstone. Jake froze, gripping the clippers until his knuckles turned white. "Hello?" His voice echoed back to him, swallowed by the night. No answer. Jake took a step forward, squinting into the gloom. He knew Paul had said not to let his imagination run wild, but this felt different, like the air had shifted, thickened with something unnatural. He took another step, his breath shallow. A low, guttural moan rippled through the darkness, coming from somewhere deep within the cemetery. Jake's blood ran cold. Suddenly, the moon slipped behind a cloud, plunging the graveyard into a suffocating blackness. And for the first time since arriving, Jake realized just how alone he really was. By the time the moon reappeared from behind the cloud, Jake had convinced himself it was just the wind playing tricks on him. The graveyard, still and quiet, felt less threatening in the moonlight. But the chill in the air lingered, wrapping around him like an unseen presence. Jake finished trimming the last of the hedges and decided to take a break. Paul had said the job was easy, but the creeping feeling of being watched had worn down his nerves. He wandered past rows of headstones, reading the names and dates etched into the stone. Some were new, others worn smooth by time. It struck him how every grave told a story, but most of those stories had long been forgotten. That was when he saw it, set apart from the others, tucked away behind a crumbling stone angel. A small, weathered headstone stood crooked, half buried in dirt and weeds. Unlike the others, it bore no name, no inscription, only a single date, 1789. Jake frowned. The cemetery wasn't supposed to be that old. Hollow Hills had been established in the late 1800s, according to Paul. He knelt down, brushing dirt from the base of the stone. There, half hidden by the soil, were strange symbols carved into the surface. They looked like nothing he had ever seen, intertwining spirals and jagged lines that seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight. His hand hovered over the stone, an inexplicable urge to touch it growing inside him. But just as his fingers grazed the cold surface, a sudden gust of wind kicked up, sending leaves swirling through the air. The wind howled through the graves, a low, keening wail that sounded eerily like someone, or something, was crying out. Jake jumped back, heart pounding. He glanced around, but no one was there. The wind settled as quickly as it had started, leaving the graveyard in an unnatural silence. "What the hell?" he muttered to himself, backing away from the stone. His mind raced with questions. Why was this grave unmarked? Why was it so much older than the others? And what did the symbols mean? Still rattled, Jake forced himself to move on, but his eyes kept flicking back toward the grave as he made his way to the chapel. A gnawing feeling twisted in his gut, telling him that the grave, whoever or whatever it belonged to, wasn't something he should be messing with. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Moonlight filtered through the cracked, stained glass windows, casting strange, fractured patterns across the floor. Jake didn't stay long, just long enough to make sure the doors were locked and the place was secure. But as he turned to leave, his gaze was drawn to the far corner of the room. There, on a rotting pew, lay an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and frayed. Curiosity piqued. Jake picked it up. The cover was worn, and the pages inside were filled with cramped, barely legible handwriting. The entries were dated decades ago, long before Paul had started working here. Most of it seemed to be mundane notes about cemetery maintenance, but one entry, near the middle of the journal, caught Jake's eye. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. October 12th, 1904. Another unmarked grave discovered today. No record of burial, no family. Something is wrong. I keep hearing whispers. Must be the wind. Must be. The next entry was even shorter. Found symbols on the grave. Old. Too old. Shouldn't be here. Something stirs beneath. I can feel it. Night after night. It calls. Jake's fingers tightened around the edges of the journal. His heart thudded in his chest as he realized the caretaker was describing the very grave he had just found. The cryptic symbols, the unnatural age of the site. It was all connected. Suddenly, the chapel felt suffocating, its once empty walls pressing in on him. He shoved the journal into his jacket and hurried outside, desperate for fresh air. But even the cool night breeze did little to calm his nerves. His mind raced with the caretaker's warnings, the mysterious symbols and the eerie cry he had heard earlier. Jake glanced back at the unmarked grave, now just a shadow in the distance. A dark foreboding tugged at him, a feeling that whatever was buried beneath those stones had not been laid to rest. The wind rustled again, carrying with it a faint, far-off whisper. This time it was unmistakable, a voice calling his name. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the journal was some kind of warning, meant for anyone who dared to stay too long at Hollow Hills. The caretaker who had written those entries had clearly been afraid of something, and now, more than a century later, Jake was beginning to understand why. His shifts had grown stranger with each passing night. The once routine tasks of locking the gates and trimming the hedges now felt like walking through a nightmare. Whispers seemed to follow him wherever he went, barely audible but persistent, like someone, or something, was trying to get his attention. Then there were the lights. They began appearing 2 nights after he found the unmarked grave. At first, it was just a faint glow on the edge of the cemetery, flickering among the gravestones like a distant lantern. But as the nights wore on, the lights moved closer, hovering above the earth, casting an unnatural, pale hue across the headstones. The other workers had noticed too, though none of them seemed particularly alarmed. If anything, they appeared detached, almost indifferent. Jake had asked Paul about it one evening as they stood together by the maintenance shed. The older man shrugged, the cigarette between his lips glowing red. Just tricks of the moonlight, kid. You get used to it. But Jake wasn't so sure. There was something off about Paul lately. He seemed more distant, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a strange lethargy. His eyes had taken on a glassy, faraway look, as though he was only half present. The other workers were the same, moving through their shifts like they were sleepwalking, their faces blank, their voices flat. The odd behavior had started around the same time Jake discovered the journal. And it wasn't just the way they acted. Some of them didn't even seem to remember the events of the night before. Jake had tried asking about the lights, the whispers, but their responses were vague, disinterested. Then, one night, a co-worker named Marcus mentioned something that made Jake's blood run cold. "Strange, ain't it?" Marcus had said, as they stood by a cluster of freshly dug graves. His voice was distant, like he wasn't entirely aware of what he was saying. "Some nights, they come and visit." Jake blinked. "What do you mean, they?" Marcus didn't answer at first, just stared off into the distance, eyes glazed. "The ones who don't rest. They walk between the graves. Watch us. Sometimes they follow you home." Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had heard plenty of ghost stories in his life, but Marcus wasn't trying to scare him. The way he spoke, it was like he was stating a fact, as casual as talking about the weather. That night, as Jake made his rounds, he couldn't stop thinking about what Marcus had said. The lights were out again, glowing faintly just beyond the tree line. The whispers, too, seemed louder, more insistent, though he still couldn't make out the words. As the night dragged on, Jake found himself wandering toward the back of the cemetery, where the older graves lay forgotten. He hadn't planned to go back to the unmarked grave, but something was drawing him there. The wind was still, the air unnervingly quiet. But as he neared the grave, the ground beneath his feet felt wrong, loose, as though it had been disturbed. His breath quickened when he saw it. The earth around the grave had been freshly turned. Jake dropped to his knees, his heart pounding in his chest. Someone had been here, digging. The grave itself was open, a jagged hole where the headstone had once stood. But there was no sign of a coffin, no remains, only the dark, yawning pit. Suddenly, a rustling noise came from behind him. Jake spun around, heart hammering in his chest. The trees surrounding the cemetery swayed gently, though there was no wind. Between the shadows of the graves, he saw movement, small, deliberate. His pulse raced as he strained to see, but the figure disappeared before he could make sense of it. His instinct screamed at him to leave, but something in him, some terrible, reckless curiosity, kept him rooted to the spot. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Paul, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He stood at the edge of the graveyard, staring at Jake with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You shouldn't be here," Paul said, his voice low and almost empty. "You're not meant to see this." Before Jake could respond, Paul turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he had come. Jake remained frozen for several long moments, his mind racing. Something was terribly wrong here, something the workers knew but refused to acknowledge. And now, as he stared at the disturbed grave, the truth began to sink in. He wasn't alone in the cemetery tonight. Something was watching him. Something that didn't want to be disturbed. Jake barely slept after that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the open grave, the way the earth had been disturbed, and the hollow look in Paul's eyes. The workers were acting more strangely with each passing shift, silent, their expressions vacant, as if their minds were somewhere else. The cemetery itself seemed to grow darker, the trees casting longer shadows, the air heavy with the scent of decayed leaves and damp soil. On the fifth night, everything changed. Jake arrived at the cemetery just after sundown, the sky painted in hues of bruised purple and deepening black. He felt the weight of the keys in his pocket as he made his rounds, the familiar clank of metal somehow comforting. But the unease never left him. As he approached the back of the graveyard, where the unmarked grave had been unearthed, his stomach twisted with dread. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the ground. Dozens of graves had shifted. Some were sunken into the earth as if the weight of the world had pulled them deeper. Others had been split wide open, their headstones toppled over. But the strangest part wasn't the ruined graves. It was the way the soil seemed to pulse. October 20th, 1904. We should have left the grave alone. The symbols weren't warnings. They were seals. We've broken the seals, and now something is waking. I don't know how long we have before it's fully free, but the signs are all here. The dead aren't resting anymore. The earth is moving. The voices are louder. Whatever was buried here centuries ago, it was meant to stay buried. Jake's heart pounded as he read on. The next few pages were filled with frantic scrawls, barely legible, as if the caretaker had been writing in a frenzy, terrified of what was happening around him. I hear them at night. They call my name. The others don't notice it, but I do. They know I'm the one who found the grave. I think they want me to join them. Jake slammed the journal shut, his hands trembling. The seals, those strange symbols on the unmarked grave, were never meant to be deciphered. They were ancient, a warning from long ago. And Paul had been right. By disturbing that grave, they had unleashed something that should have remained trapped beneath the soil. A loud crash outside startled him. His pulse quickened, and for a moment he thought the dead had followed him. But when he peeked through the small window, he saw Marcus, the same co-worker who had told him about the visitors after dark, standing in the shadows by the fence. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his eyes vacant. Jake slowly opened the door and called out to him. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" Marcus didn't respond. He just stood there, staring into the distance as if he couldn't see Jake at all. The eerie silence was suffocating. "Marcus!" Jake shouted again, taking a step closer. But before he could reach him, Marcus turned abruptly and started walking toward the chapel. His movements were stiff and jerky, like he was being controlled by something unseen. Without thinking, Jake followed him. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rows of gravestones. Marcus didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge Jake's presence. He just walked, straight and purposeful, toward the ancient chapel at the center of the cemetery. Jake's heart raced as they approached the chapel. Something about the place felt wrong, more wrong than usual. The door, which he had locked just hours earlier, now stood slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp rot. Marcus entered without hesitation, disappearing into the darkness. Jake hesitated for a moment, fear clawing at his throat, but he couldn't leave Marcus in there alone. He had to know what was happening. He stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under his weight. The chapel was even darker than he remembered, the stained glass windows covered in grime. At the far end, Marcus stood motionless in front of the altar, staring down at something on the floor. Jake swallowed hard and approached, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. As he reached Marcus, his breath caught in his throat. There, on the ground beneath the altar, was another grave, unmarked, but this one was different. It had no headstone, no symbols, only a pile of disturbed earth and a hollow, gaping hole where a coffin should have been. Marcus turned slowly, his vacant eyes meeting Jake's. "They're waking up," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They want to finish what they started." Jake took a step back, his mind reeling. Who's waking up? What is this place?" Marcus's gaze dropped to the floor. "It's not just the dead, Jake. Something else is buried here. Something older. It's been waiting, watching." Before Jake could react, the earth beneath the altar began to tremble. A low rumble vibrated through the floor, and the smell of decay grew stronger. The hollow grave at their feet shifted, the soil writhing as though something was moving beneath it. Suddenly, Marcus's eyes widened in terror. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We've woken it up." The ground split open, and from the dark void beneath the chapel came a sound, a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. Something was coming, something that had been buried long before the cemetery existed. And now, it was rising. Jake stumbled back as the ground beneath the chapel cracked wide open. The air was thick with the smell of rotting earth, and something far older, something foul. The low growl continued to echo from deep within the pit, growing louder with each second. He glanced at Marcus, whose face had gone pale, frozen in place with a mixture of terror and acceptance. "Marcus, we have to go!" Jake shouted, but Marcus didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the dark void beneath the altar, his lips barely moving as he muttered something under his breath. Jake grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Come on, we have to get out of here!" Finally, Marcus looked at him, but his eyes were hollow, distant. "It's awake, Jake. You can't run from it. None of us can." Before Jake could respond, the floor beneath them trembled violently. A dark, sinewy shape began to rise from the pit, its form barely visible in the flickering light of the chapel's failing candles. Long, gnarled limbs clawed their way up from the earth, covered in thick, wet soil. Whatever had been buried here was no longer human, if it ever had been. Jake's mind raced. He had read enough of the journal to know that this thing was tied to the cemetery's history, perhaps to the land itself. The seals on the unmarked grave had been broken, and now the thing that should have been locked away was free. He knew instinctively that this creature wasn't just another restless spirit. It was ancient, something far more dangerous, something that had been imprisoned for centuries. Marcus began to speak again, his voice trembling with fear. It's the one they tried to hide. The grave wasn't unmarked by mistake. They buried it without a name because it was too dangerous, too powerful. The others, the dead, they were supposed to keep it trapped. But now they've risen, and it's free. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through Jake's bones. Its body seemed to shift and swell as it emerged fully from the earth, towering over them. Its face, or what passed for one, was a twisted mass of shadows, with hollow pits where eyes should have been, and long, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Jake took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He had never seen anything like this before, something so old, so powerful, that it radiated malice. He could feel it, pressing down on him like a weight, as if the very air was suffocating him. Suddenly, Marcus began walking toward the creature, his steps slow and deliberate. "I hear them, Jake," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're calling me. I don't think I can fight it." "Marcus, stop!" Jake shouted, but it was too late. Marcus moved closer to the creature, his expression calm, almost peaceful, as though he was surrendering to whatever force had been pulling him toward this moment. Without hesitation, the creature's long, twisted arm reached out and wrapped its clawed hand around Marcus, pulling him into the darkness. Jake's breath caught in his throat as Marcus disappeared into the shadows. The creature let out a deep, guttural snarl, and for a moment, the entire chapel seemed to vibrate with the force of its rage. The floor continued to crack and shift, and the walls groaned as if they were on the verge of collapse. Jake didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The chapel felt like it was closing in on him, the shadows stretching, trying to pull him back. He burst through the doors and into the cold night air, the wind biting at his skin. Behind him, the chapel shuddered, the faint sound of that horrible growl still echoing through the cemetery. He didn't stop running until he reached the main gates. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. Finally, he managed to unlock the gate and shove it open, stumbling out onto the street. He turned back to look at the cemetery one last time, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The graveyard was still, but he knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been buried beneath the chapel, whatever had risen from the earth, wasn't going to stay confined to Hollow Hills for long. The seals had been broken, the dead were no longer resting, and now something far worse was free. Jake collapsed onto the pavement, his mind racing. He had read enough of the journal to know there was no easy way to stop this. The creature was tied to the land, to the very history of the cemetery, and whatever force had imprisoned it so long ago was now gone. But he couldn't just leave. He couldn't just walk away and pretend this wasn't happening. The whispers on the wind were louder now, almost deafening. They called his name, just as they had called Marcus's. Jake shuddered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as the cold crept into his bones. He knew what he had to do. If he was going to survive, if anyone was going to survive, he had to find a way to stop the thing that had awakened. And he had to do it before it was too late. With one last glance at the cemetery, Jake stood up, his legs shaky but determined. He didn't know where to start, but he knew one thing for certain. The night wasn't over, and neither was the horror.